Hey everyone, Reid Henrichs with Ridge, and the purpose of today's video is to explain that the Second Amendment does not give you the right to own a gun. Did the title get your attention? Well, it should, because you may be asking, how is a firearms instructor and a guy that taught history and is a pro-constitutional guy and individual liberty and limited government person, how is he saying this? Well, it's quite simple. The Second Amendment doesn't give you that right at all. What it does do is simply recognize something that has existed before any government was ever created by any human beings. It is simply acknowledging and recognizing something that has existed, that continues to exist, and that will exist well into the future. To understand this concept, we have to look at what the Bill of Rights actually is. The Bill of Rights, of course, is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights are not the same thing. Believe me, I've had this argument with many a young individual who, by the way, was in graduate school for history, who believed that the Bill of Rights and the Constitution were the same thing. Well, if we simply look at history, we know that is not true. See, the Constitution was in 1787, and the Bill of Rights, of course, was officially ratified in 1791. So we see a 4-year difference there. Now, why is this important? What is the Bill of Rights? Bill of Rights is a list. It's not exhaustive by any means, but what it is a list of rights that government must recognize, and this was drawn up by a group of people called the Anti-Federalists. Some of these guys included Richard Henry Lee, Patrick Henry, George Mason, just to name a few. But I will tell you that they put the Bill of Rights into effect for one specific reason, and that is because a lot of these guys were very skeptical and fearful of what the Constitution could bring about. The Anti-Federalists believed that the Constitution was too broad. They believed that it gave government much too broad of power and that the language was not specific enough to limit the government into what powers that it had. They also believed that words, this is paraphrasing what they said, they also believed that in the future, in other words, not their generation, but people in the future in government, would use the broadness, they would use the ambiguity of the language of the Constitution to deny citizens of the United States certain rights. So the reason that it was put into effect, the Bill of Rights, that was added to the Constitution, that it was amendments to the Constitution, the reason it was put in there was to guarantee that government would continue to recognize specific individual liberties as well as the powers of the states. Originally, there were 189 of them that were proposed. That's right, 189. And of course, that was distilled down to 10 that they deemed were very essential for a free society. The Bill of Rights was written at a time where people were extremely familiar with tyranny, and also we're talking right immediately after our forefathers earned independence from Great Britain after an extremely hard and difficult fight. So this is the environment where the Bill of Rights was constructed, was right after the revolution had been fought. I mean, it's affected everybody. And we're also talking about a time where our founders knew tendencies of government because they were well read in history. They knew tendencies of government and what they sought to do. So the environment that the Bill of Rights was created in was one of extreme distrust of government and the powers that it could potentially have. As I said, the Bill of Rights is not an exhausted list of freedoms, and they're not enumerated. And in fact, the 9th Amendment says that the rights in the Bill of Rights are not enumerated in any order of importance. But it does demonstrate the thought of our founders and the freedoms that they held quite dear and what they believed that every free citizen should enjoy and have government protect for them. Regarding the Second Amendment, I think it's also important to bring to light that no federal gun legislation was even passed until the 1930s under President Roosevelt. President Roosevelt had a big disdain for the Constitution and especially the Bill of Rights. We see this evidenced in his little comments like the Constitution was a document from the quaint times of horses and buggies, things like that. We also see this in his new Bill of Rights that he wanted to create. We also see this in his attempt to create an entirely new Supreme Court with more justices than it was designed to have. So we see that kind of attitude and that kind of mentality and that kind of individual who despised the Constitution and everything that it stood for. And what it stood for was limiting government. That's what the Constitution always has stood for. But we look at this and we think about there was no federal gun legislation passed until the 1930s. Why did it take so long for the federal government to propose any kind of gun control? Well, for one, nobody in government even thought about it before then. That's not to say that certain states attempted gun control on specific parts of the population, specifically Democrat controlled states a long time ago tried to enact gun control on blacks, and especially big time on Native Americans. And the whole purpose there, of course, was to control those groups of people. And we look back at that and we most certainly are not proud of the government trying to control someone by barring them the use of arms. That should be your first clue that gun control is not a good thing. And it should also be your first clue that the only purpose of disarming a population is to better control it, as evidenced on reservations and also evidenced in the South regarding black citizens by state governments. The final point that I want to discuss about the Second Amendment not giving you a right to carry a firearm is that rights don't come from government ever. And if rights don't come from government, how then could the Second Amendment give you a right to keep and bear arms? That right existed previously to any of the United States. It existed previous to any government on earth, so it doesn't give you that right. It simply recognizes that right to keep and bear arms. That's all it does. It acknowledges and recognizes the right to keep and bear arms. We think about these things, our rights, as evidenced in our foundational document, the Declaration of Independence, when Thomas Jefferson and his committee wrote that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. That means that our rights come from the Creator, not other human beings, and most certainly not government. That's part of the foundation of this country, is the realization that our rights do come from a Creator. They do not come from governments. They do not come from men or women or anything like that. They are endowed to us. We are born with them. Just because other governments don't recognize that, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Our forefathers understood this, and that's why the American Revolution was fought, was because the government of Great Britain and Parliament and King George III were not recognizing or respecting their rights as Englishmen, and that's why the Revolution happened. The Second Amendment to the Constitution of the United States was not given to you by government. All it simply does is recognize a fact that already is, was, and has been from the beginning of the first human beings. If you found the information in the video helpful, subscribe to the channel, follow me on Facebook. That link is down below. If you want to learn more about the history of your country, as well as the Second Amendment, and better yet, how to use it, come on out to Valor Ridge. We'll teach you how to do just that. This is Reid Henrichs with Valor Ridge, reminding you the lessons that we learn are written on the tombstones of others. We'll see you on the ridge.